The woman sitting across from my husband was careful. I noticed that first. Not beautiful in any obvious way. Composed. The kind of composed that takes practice. She held her wine glass by the stem, not the bowl, and she never once looked at me longer than politeness required. Her name was Ingrid Merck. Conrad had introduced her as a business associate visiting from Germany. He said it the way he said everything, smoothly, with just enough warmth to make the room feel safe. I was not safe. I had not been safe for weeks. My name is Marlowe Fossey. I am a literature and linguistics professor at a university in Memphis, Tennessee. I have spent 20 years studying how language works, how people use words to reveal what they are trying to hide. I have built my entire career on the understanding that what a person says and what a person means are rarely the same thing. Conrad knew I studied language. He assumed that meant I studied it from the outside. He never once considered that fluency is not an academic exercise. For a woman like me, it is simply another room I live in. He made that mistake for 12 years. He made it for the last time that night. If you are watching this from anywhere in the world, drop your city in the comments. I want to know where this story is landing. The restaurant was the kind Conrad chose when he wanted to feel significant. White tablecloths, low lighting, a wine list with a leather cover. He had ordered for the table before I arrived. Another small performance of control, dressed as consideration. He was relaxed in the way of a man who believes everything is already decided. Ingrid was precise. I was quiet. And the evening moved the way these evenings do, with polished conversation and careful smiles, until Conrad leaned slightly toward Ingrid and shifted languages. German. Casual. Unhurried. The German of a man who has verified, to his own satisfaction, that no one at the table understands him. He told her the pills were already in rotation, that the timeline was 2 days, that everything I had inherited, everything held inside what he called the Aldine Trust, a name that exists on no public document, would finally be where it belongs. He used the word ersetzen, replaced. Ingrid responded in the measured tone of someone finalizing a transaction, not conducting a conversation. My phone was face down beside my dessert fork. It had been recording since the moment he switched languages. 3 weeks earlier, I had stood in a hallway and overheard a phone call that told me to stay ready. I had been ready. I poured more wine with a hand that did not tremble, and I listened to every word my husband said about my death, with the full comprehension of a woman who has spent her life inside language. When he finished, I set my glass down. I looked at Ingrid, not Conrad, and I spoke in perfect German. I said there is a difference between calm and stupid, and she should have learned that before she put her name on those filings. 3 seconds. That is exactly how long Ingrid Merck's composure held before something moved behind her eyes. Conrad went completely still beside her, the stillness of a man whose entire architecture has just collapsed in a single sentence. I picked up my purse. I stood without rushing. I walked out of that restaurant without looking back at either of them. The other diners saw nothing except a well-dressed woman leaving with her dignity intact. I sat in my car for 30 seconds. Then I made 3 calls, my attorney Sylvia Drummond, my doctor, and my trust counsel Noel Carver. Conrad's name lit up my screen before I finished dialing. I watched it. I said nothing. For 3 weeks, I had been gathering pieces. At that dinner table, Conrad handed me the one he never meant me to have. I was not surprised at that dinner table. I was confirmed. There is a difference, and it matters. Surprise belongs to women who weren't paying attention. I had been paying attention for 3 weeks. Since the evening I came home early from a faculty meeting and stood in the hallway outside Conrad's study and heard my husband speaking French to someone he never mentioned. He didn't hear me come in. The door was pulled nearly shut, and he was deep inside a conversation that had nothing to do with business, not the kind he had ever described to me. I stood still and I listened. I didn't catch every word, but I caught enough. remplacer, to replace, then la posologie, dosage, then l'accumulation. The kind of word that has no place in a real estate call or a contractor negotiation or anything Conrad had ever claimed to be managing. Those words belong to a pharmaceutical register, a medical one. And they were coming out of my husband's mouth with the ease of a man who had been thinking about them for a long time. Then he laughed. That was the part that stayed with me longest. Not the words, the laugh. Easy, unguarded. The laugh of a man who believes he is completely safe. I had not heard Conrad laugh like that in years. I stood in that hallway and understood, without being able to name it fully yet, that I was hearing something I was never meant to hear. I did not walk into that study. I went to the kitchen, set my bag down quietly, and started the kettle. When Conrad came out 20 minutes later, I was reading at the counter. He kissed my cheek and asked how the meeting went. I told him fine. I smiled. I had already decided not to say a single word until I understood exactly what I was dealing with. That night, I sat at my desk and opened a document on my laptop. I typed the date, the time, and every word I had heard. The French phrases, the register, the laugh, the numbers in the timeline he referenced. That document became the first page of a folder. Over the following weeks, that folder grew. I want to explain something about how I work, because it matters to what comes next. My academic field is forensic linguistics and language acquisition. I have spent 20 years studying how people use language to conceal intention. I completed my doctoral research with 3 extended stays in Germany. My German fluency was built in university libraries and academic conferences before I ever met Conrad. I never spoke it at home. It was a working language, not a domestic one. Conrad knew I studied languages. He assumed that meant I analyzed them from a distance. He never considered that for a woman like me, fluency is not a skill. It is simply another room I live in. He assumed. He never verified. In 12 years, he never once thought to ask. The weeks after that phone call taught me other things. I started seeing what I had been too trusting to register before. Conrad's phone never left his hand. Business trips that didn't quite align with the calendar he shared with me. And every evening without fail, he brought me tea, stood there while I drank it, watched me with an attention I had mistaken for tenderness. It was not tenderness. It was monitoring. A woman who has spent her career reading the gap between what people say and what they mean does not stay blind to that gap in her own home. Not once she starts looking. By the end of the 3rd week, I understood. This was not a struggling marriage. This was not restlessness. This was a plan. And I was the target. That realization did not break me. It focused me completely. That same night, I picked up my pill bottle. I carried it to my desk lamp. I held one tablet up to the light. And I saw it. The tablet was wrong. Not dramatically wrong. Not the kind of wrong that announces itself. Wrong in the way that only registers when you are already looking. A slightly different coding. A weight in my palm that was off by a margin most people would never notice. The color was close. But close is not exact. And I have spent my entire career understanding that the distance between close and exact is where the truth lives. I stood at my desk lamp for a long moment. Then I placed the tablet back in the bottle, closed it, and set it back in exactly the position it had been in. Same angle, same distance from the edge of the nightstand. I turned off the lamp and got into bed and lay in the dark next to my husband and said nothing. In the morning, I waited until Conrad left for the office. Then I made 2 calls. The first was to my physician. Carefully worded, no mention of Conrad. Nothing that would create a record I couldn't control. I told her I had a concern about my current prescription batch and requested a medication review. She scheduled me for later that week. The second call I didn't make by phone at all. I walked across campus to the pharmacology division and knocked on the office door of a colleague whose research focuses on drug compound analysis. I told her I was looking into pharmaceutical composition consistency for an academic inquiry and asked if she could compare two samples. I handed her a sealed envelope. She said she'd take a look. I paid for my real prescription out of pocket at a pharmacy on the other side of Memphis. I specifically did not run it through our shared insurance. Conrad had access to those records. I was not going to let a second fill date on my medication tell him anything before I was ready. 3 days later, my pharmacology colleague called me into her office and closed the door. The tablets were not identical. That was the first thing she told me. The second was that one sample appeared inconsistent with the medication it was supposed to be. She was careful about how she said it, careful about what she was willing to conclude. She told me her review was not a forensic analysis and not something she would ever present as one. What she could say was that the tablets deserved a proper laboratory examination and that if they belonged to a member of her family, she would want that examination done immediately. That was enough. I thanked her, walked back to my office, closed my own door, and sat for exactly 4 minutes. I allowed myself that. 4 minutes to feel the full weight of what I had just confirmed. Not that I knew everything, but that I knew enough. Enough to stop taking anything Conrad handed me. Enough to start asking questions. Enough to understand that the man I had shared a bed with for 12 years might be connected to something far darker than I had wanted to believe. Then I stood up. I had work to do. I began taking my real medication every morning in my office before Conrad was awake. I maintained the count in his bottle precisely, replacing the correct number of tablets daily so the quantity never changed. Everything in that nightstand looked exactly as it had. He had no reason to believe anything had shifted. He was wrong about that, the same way he had been wrong about the German. I pulled my medical records from the previous 8 weeks. The fatigue I had attributed to a flare, the mornings that felt like dragging myself through water, the heaviness I had accepted as my body's familiar pattern. For the first time, I stopped assuming those symptoms meant what I thought they meant. My own body had been keeping a record of something. I simply didn't know what it was yet. That night, Conrad came to bed, kissed my forehead, and reminded me to take my pills. I smiled and told him I already did. The most dangerous thing I could do was change my behavior. So I didn't. I understood that the morning after I confirmed the pills. Conrad was not watching for a woman who knew. He was watching for a woman who was declining. Those are two entirely different performances, and I have spent 20 years studying exactly how human beings perform for one another, what they show, what they withhold, and where the seams appear when the performance starts to slip. I was not going to slip. I was going to give him precisely what he expected to see, for exactly as long as I needed him to keep believing it. I moved slower in the mornings, not dramatically, just the kind of gradual heaviness that reads as a body working harder than it should. I reduced my visible energy in the evenings. I let fatigue show in my eyes at dinner without manufacturing it in my voice. A woman with lupus having a difficult stretch does not perform. She simply has less. That was what I gave him. Less. Measured. Consistent. The performance of a woman whose body was losing a quiet battle she didn't yet know she was in. Conrad watched. That is the only word for it. He watched me the way a person watches something they have a stake in, not with worry exactly, but with attention. He brought tea every evening and set it beside me without being asked. He adjusted the angle of my pillow before bed. He suggested twice that I speak to my department chair about reducing my course load for the semester. And at a faculty dinner midway through those 2 weeks, I heard him tell a colleague that I had been having a difficult stretch with my health. He said it with his hand briefly on my back and the measured concern of a devoted husband. The room received it exactly as he intended. He was building a narrative. I was building a case. both of us performing every single evening at the same table. I documented every reminder. Every time Conrad mentioned my pills, I noted the time in a small notebook I kept inside a textbook on my office shelf, a place he had no reason to open. Over 14 days, he reminded me daily. Some evenings twice, once at dinner and again before bed, checking in a second time when I hadn't acknowledged the first. That frequency is not the behavior of a concerned husband. A concerned husband reminds you once and trusts you. What Conrad was doing was monitoring a schedule, 14 entries, each one time-stamped, each one written in the precise, unambiguous language of a woman who understands exactly what constitutes evidence of intent. During that same period, I called Bernadette Cole, a colleague I have trusted for years, about a department scheduling matter. We spoke for 20 minutes about nothing consequential. But near the end of the call, Conrad's name came up naturally, the way it does when two colleagues share a professional world with a spouse. I listened to how Bernadette answered. There was a pause before she spoke, brief, controlled, the kind of pause a careful person inserts when they are deciding how much to say. She chose the diplomatic response, but the pause told me she had considered another one. I filed it and said nothing. I want to be honest about what those 2 weeks cost. Performing weakness for a man who is trying to kill you is not a neutral act. It requires you to move through your own home as though you are shrinking while everything inside you is sharpening. There were mornings I stood in the bathroom and looked at myself in the mirror and had to remind myself that the woman looking back was not the one he thought he was watching. She was something else entirely, something he hadn't accounted for. Then one evening, Conrad looked up from his phone and told me he had made a dinner reservation. A business colleague visiting from Germany. He said her name was Ingrid Merck. I had 3 days before Sylvia Drummond and 5 days before the dinner. I used every hour of them. I started with what I could access: public records, academic databases, corporate filing repositories that a university research login opens without friction. I typed Ingrid Merck's name into the first search at 11 o'clock on a Wednesday night, and I did not stop until I understood as much as I could about who she was. What I found did not come all at once. It built. One document referencing another, one filing pointing to a name that pointed to a company that pointed back to Conrad. The kind of trail that looks like coincidence until you have followed enough of it to see the shape. Ingrid Merck was not a casual coworker. She held a consultancy role in 2 of Conrad's holding companies, the same 2 whose restructuring filings had crossed Bernadette's brother's desk months earlier. Her name was not recent. The earliest document I found with her name on it was dated 4 years into my marriage. Conrad had been working with Ingrid, building something with Ingrid, for nearly a third of the time we had been together. While I was teaching seminars and publishing research and managing my health and trusting the man across the dinner table, he had been building a professional relationship with another woman that was far more extensive than anything he had ever acknowledged. I pulled everything I had legitimate access to: joint tax returns, property records, and the original documentation connected to my inheritance. I spread it across my desk and began reading it the way I read primary sources. Slowly, with full attention, looking for patterns rather than conclusions. Certain things immediately stood out. The same entities appeared repeatedly. The same company names surfaced in places I did not expect them. Several documents Conrad had asked me to sign years earlier suddenly looked less routine than I remembered. I could not yet tell exactly what they meant, but I no longer believed they meant nothing. The more I read, the more one fact became impossible to ignore. Ingrid was not standing at the edge of Conrad's business world. She was inside it. The earliest document connecting her to one of those entities was dated 8 years ago. 8 years. I sat with that number for a long time. 8 years ago, I was building my academic career, managing my diagnosis, loving a man I believed was building a life with me. 8 years ago, Ingrid's name was already appearing beside his. There was one document that held my attention longer than the others. An internal corporate amendment filed 6 years earlier. Ingrid's signature appeared beside. Conrad's on the execution page. Not as a witness. Not as an administrative contact. As an approving party. I read that page 3 times. People do not receive that level of authority by accident. They receive it because someone wants them inside the structure. I added the document to the front section of the folder. I want to be precise about what I felt when I understood that. It was not rage. Rage would have been easier, cleaner, louder, something I could have discharged and moved past. What I felt was colder than that. A settling. The particular clarity that arrives when a suspicion stops being hypothetical and becomes documented. I still did not understand the full structure. I knew that. But I understood enough to know I needed people whose expertise went beyond mine. That was why Sylvia mattered. That was why Noel Carver mattered. And that was why the dinner mattered. Just before midnight, one final filing surfaced in the search results. A routine annual disclosure attached to one of Conrad's entities. Ingrid's name appeared again. Same address for service, same corporate counsel, same network of companies. By then, the pattern was impossible to ignore. This wasn't a consultant drifting in and out of Conrad's world. This was a woman who had been positioned inside it for years. I printed everything I had found, added it to the folder, turned off my desk lamp. Conrad came in at 11. He kissed my forehead. He reminded me to take my pills. I looked at him and told him I loved him. It was the last time I would say it. I knew that when I said it. I walked into Sylvia Drummond's office with a folder. I walked out with a strategy. Sylvia's office was on the 14th floor of a building in downtown Memphis. Clean lines, minimal decoration. The kind of space that communicates that the person inside it does not waste time on things that don't matter. She was at her desk when I came in. She stood, shook my hand, and gestured to the chair across from her. She did not offer coffee. She did not make small talk. I liked her immediately. I opened the folder and I laid everything out in sequence. The French phone call, the date, the words, the pharmaceutical register, the laugh. The preliminary analysis from my pharmacology colleague indicating that the tablets were not consistent with my prescribed medication. My medical records from the 8 weeks prior showing symptom accumulation I had attributed to my lupus. The 14 documented instances of Conrad reminding me to take my medication, each one time-stamped in my hand. The Ingrid research, her consultancy roles, the holding company connections. The document dated 8 years into our marriage with her name on it. The trust documents that had begun raising questions I could not yet answer on my own. I laid each piece down, and I let it sit before moving to the next one. Sylvia read without interrupting. When she reached the last page, she set it down and was quiet for a long moment. Then she looked at me and said that if the evidence held up under further review, we were looking at something much larger than a divorce. I played her the dinner recording. She listened to the full length of it without moving. When it finished, she asked me one question. Did I have a transcription? I took it from the folder, word for word, in my hand, with a linguistic notation header identifying my professional credentials and the basis of my transcription methodology. She read it twice. Then she told me that a tenured linguistics professor with 20 years of published academic work, transcribing in her area of expertise, would be taken very seriously. She also told me that Tennessee is a one-party consent state, and that based on what she had heard so far, the recording appeared to have been lawfully obtained. Then she turned back to the recording. What interested her most was not any single statement. It was the pattern, the references to medication, the timeline, the trust, the consistency between what Conrad said at dinner and what appeared elsewhere in the folder. Separately, each item raised questions. Together, they raised far more serious ones. She put the folder flat on her desk and told me what I was not to do. I was not to confront Conrad, not to alter my routine, not to remove documents from the house, not to contact Ingrid Merck directly. I was to continue exactly as I had been until we understood more than we understood today. I told her I already knew what to do at that table. She looked at me for a moment and said she believed me. After I left, Sylvia called Noel Carver. She told me this later, that the two of them began coordinating that same afternoon. By the time I sat down at that restaurant 2 days later, both of my attorneys were moving on parallel tracks. I walked into that dinner with a recording device and a folder of evidence. I also walked in with two professionals who understood that what I had brought them required immediate attention. Driving home, I felt something I had not felt since the night I stood in that hallway and heard Conrad laugh. I felt the weight distribute. It does not disappear. But when two sharp, capable people are carrying something with you, the shape of it changes. It becomes manageable. It becomes a structure rather than a burden. I pulled into the driveway. Conrad's car was already there. He opened the front door before I reached it. "Where have you been?" he asked. "Department meeting ran late," I said. He nodded and told me dinner was almost ready. I walked inside and set my bag down. 2 more days. Conrad expected results by now. I was still standing. I could see it in him the morning after the dinner. A tightness that hadn't been there before. Something operating just beneath the surface of his composure that a less careful observer would have missed entirely. I was not a less careful observer. I had spent the better part of 2 decades studying the space between what people present and what they are actually managing, and what Conrad was managing in the days following that dinner was the particular pressure of a plan that was not running on schedule. The timeline he had given Ingrid had passed. I was still going to work, still sitting across from him at breakfast, still here. And he could not understand why. The devoted husband performance began to cost him. Small things first. He stopped bringing tea in the evenings, not all at once, but over 3 days, with a gradual withdrawal that I recognized as a man whose attention had shifted inward. The warmth he had maintained so carefully for weeks started to compress into something clipped and functional. His sentences shortened. When I asked about his day, he answered in the minimum required and returned to his phone. The phone was the clearest signal. It had always been present, but now it went everywhere. Into the bathroom, onto the nightstand face down instead of charging on the dresser where it had sat for years, into the kitchen during breakfast in a way that read less like habit and more like management. I documented every shift. The date he stopped bringing tea. The first evening he took the phone into the bathroom. The morning he left 40 minutes before his usual time without offering an explanation. Each entry went into the notebook on my office shelf with a timestamp beside it. What Conrad experienced as private recalibration, I received as a second layer of documentation. A man whose patience is failing makes choices his disciplined self would never authorize. He was making them daily, and I was recording them all. Noel Carver called me during this period. He was careful on the phone, no specifics, no characterization beyond what was necessary. He told me his initial review of the trust documents had surfaced a concern. He had found language in one filing that didn't read like me. He wasn't prepared to say more until the full audit was complete, but he wanted me to know he was looking and that what he was seeing warranted serious attention. He would have his complete findings within the week. I thanked him, ended the call, and added it to the record. 1 line, date, time, summary. That was enough. Conrad's professional boundaries were dissolving in ways he apparently couldn't see. Ingrid Merck's name began appearing on emails that had no operational reason to include her. Scheduling threads, vendor communications, internal matters that belonged to Conrad's business world and had nothing to do with a German consultant's scope. He was folding her into the administrative fabric of his daily life. The wall he had maintained between his plan and his routine was coming down because he no longer had the patience to hold it up. Then one evening, he came to the dinner table and said, in the tone of a man raising something of no particular consequence, that he had been thinking we should update our estate documents. He said it the way you mention a grocery list item, casually, lightly, as though the thought had simply occurred to him. I looked at him across the table and said that sounded like a good idea. I told him I would call Noel Carver in the morning. The look on Conrad's face lasted less than a second, but I saw it. The next morning, I called Noel from the bedroom while Conrad was in the shower. I told him about the conversation. He told me not to sign anything. Then he told me the full audit results were ready. I hadn't given Sylvia my confirmation yet. Ingrid Merck gave her something better. The university hosts a quarterly reception. Business community, civic leadership, faculty. The kind of Memphis gathering where relationships are maintained and new ones are carefully constructed. Conrad had attended every one of them for 12 years as my husband, working the room with the practiced ease of a man who understood that visibility was its own form of capital. I had attended as his wife and as a professor whose institutional standing gave the evening a different kind of weight. We had always arrived together. We had always left together. That was the pattern. Conrad altered it that evening in a way I could not ignore. He brought Ingrid. Officially, she was there as an international consultant associated with one of his business ventures. No one would have questioned the explanation. On paper, it was entirely reasonable. What caught my attention was not her presence. It was his comfort with it. The discipline that had kept Ingrid Merck carefully compartmentalized for years had begun to loosen around the edges. Conrad introduced her to several of his closest business associates with a familiarity that exceeded the explanation he was providing. Not dramatically, not enough to attract attention from anyone who wasn't already watching. I was already watching. I stood across the room with a glass in my hand and observed. Conrad's hand settled briefly on the small of Ingrid's back during one introduction, not long enough to announce itself, long enough to be noticed. Ingrid accepted a business card from one of Conrad's oldest associates with the ease of someone who had met him before. The three of them shared a moment of recognition that felt practiced rather than new. Individually, none of it meant much. Together, it did. I photographed what I could. 3 separate moments, captured without raising my phone above table level. Clean images. Clear enough. The associate who handed Ingrid his card was a name I recognized from the holding company documents Noel and I had reviewed. He was not simply a business contact. His name appeared in multiple filings connected to the corporate structure surrounding the Aldine Trust. His comfort with Ingrid told me something Noel's documents had suggested, but not confirmed. This reception was not an introduction. It was evidence of an existing relationship. I left before Conrad noticed I had gone. I sat in my car in the parking structure and sent the photographs to Sylvia Drummond with a short summary of what I had observed. A few minutes later, her reply arrived. Interesting. Let's discuss tomorrow. That answer told me more than a longer one would have. I drove home. Conrad arrived 40 minutes later, relaxed in the way of a man whose evening had unfolded exactly as expected. He told me I looked beautiful tonight. He said it easily, with the warmth he had been carefully rationing since the dinner window passed. I thanked him and said I was tired and went to bed. I lay in the dark and thought about the word ersetzen, replaced. I thought about how the man moving around in the next room had used that word at a restaurant table about my life, about my inheritance, about everything I was. And then come home and told me I looked beautiful. I thought about what language does when people believe they are completely safe, how it tells you everything, how it always has. I thought about what was coming, and I closed my eyes. Several weeks after the reception photographs, Sylvia called me into her office. She didn't tell me why on the phone. She didn't need to. The tone of her voice was the tone of a woman who has something specific to deliver and wants to deliver it in person. I sat across from her desk, and she told me the recording had been professionally enhanced. The ambient restaurant noise that had partially obscured certain passages was no longer a factor. What the enhancement produced was a clean, complete record of everything Conrad and Ingrid said at that table, from the moment he switched languages to the moment I set down my glass. She slid the transcript across the desk, the enhanced version, cross-referenced against my own. I had provided my transcription in my professional capacity weeks earlier, and an independent certified translator retained during the investigation had now verified it against the enhanced audio. No material discrepancy. Not a single contested phrase. What I had written at my desk the night of the dinner, word for word in the language I had spent years working inside, was confirmed as accurate by an independent professional. Sylvia told me what that meant in practical terms. I was no longer simply the victim in this matter. I was also a potential expert witness. Conrad had chosen to conduct his conspiracy in a language he assumed I didn't speak. He had handed me the evidentiary instrument I needed and signed it with his own voice. What the recording carried was not just intent, it was specificity. He named the compound discussed at the dinner table, the same compound later identified through certified laboratory testing of the substituted tablets. He referenced the accumulation timeline in numbers that aligned precisely with the 8 weeks of symptom records I had pulled from my medical file. And he used the Aldine Trust's internal nickname, a name that exists on no public document, that appears in no filing accessible without direct knowledge of the Trust's private structure. That detail placed Conrad inside the documentation in a way that no amount of professional distance or plausible deniability could walk back. Combined with everything Noel Carver had surfaced in the audit, it closed the last significant gap in the evidentiary chain. Then Sylvia told me about Ingrid. In the weeks following the initial filings and investigative inquiries, Ingrid Merck had retained separate legal counsel. She and Conrad no longer shared representation. Sylvia explained what that meant carefully. Ingrid retaining separate counsel was not the same as Ingrid cooperating with investigators. But in a conspiracy case, it changes the landscape immediately. Whatever story Conrad intended to tell, he would now be telling it without the automatic protection of a unified defense strategy. The financial dimension of the matter had also expanded. What began as a review of trust documentation and local records had widened as additional filings were collected. Several of Conrad's entities operated across state lines. Corporate records, restructuring documents, and financial transfers were now being compared against one another by investigators and forensic accountants reviewing the growing body of evidence. Sylvia was careful not to overstate what that meant. No conclusions had been reached. No final determinations had been made. But enough questions had emerged that agencies outside the original investigative team had begun reviewing portions of the documentation within their respective jurisdictions. Conrad's business world was no longer being examined by people who knew him. It was being examined by people who only knew the records. I sat in that office and felt something I had not expected to feel. Not relief, exactly. Something quieter and more durable. I had started this with a phone call I wasn't meant to hear, and a pill that weighed wrong in my hand. I had built it one document at a time, one timestamp at a time, one word at a time. What it had become was larger than anything I could have constructed alone. Sylvia told me investigators were preparing the next phase of the case. She told me not to be at home when certain actions were taken. She told me to be somewhere calm, somewhere I could be reached. I thought of Bernadette's office, the chair across from her desk, the morning light through her window. I knew exactly where I would be. Tuesday morning, I woke before Conrad, the way I had been waking before him for weeks, not from anxiety, but from intention. I made coffee. I moved through the kitchen the way I always moved through it. I set his cup beside the machine the way I always did. I did everything at the same pace, with the same rhythm. as every other morning he had watched me move through this house, believing I was declining. I was not declining. I was leaving. My bag was already in my car. I had assembled it over 3 days, one item at a time, chosen carefully. Nothing Conrad would register as missing from its place. A woman who has been performing normal for weeks knows exactly how to pack without disturbing the performance. I had learned to be precise about what I needed and invisible about the taking of it. Bernadette's guest room had been ready since Sunday. Conrad did not know that. Conrad did not know most of what was true about this morning. I kissed him on the cheek before I left. He was half awake, reaching for his phone before he was fully upright. I told him I had an early meeting. He made a sound that meant fine without assembling it into a word. I picked up my bag, walked out the front door, and drove toward campus on the same route I drove every morning at the same time I always drove it. I went directly to Bernadette's office. I sat in the chair across from her desk, set my coffee beside me, and opened a stack of student essays I needed to grade. Bernadette was already at her desk when I arrived. She looked at me once, reading whatever she needed to read, and then she opened her own work and we sat together in the particular quiet of two women who understand that some mornings require presence more than words. At 9:08, I know the time because I noted it. Federal investigators and Memphis law enforcement executed the search warrant on Conrad's office building across the city. I was not there. I did not watch. I was reading a graduate student's essay about the performative function of silence in political speech and writing comments in the margin in my usual hand. Conrad called at 9:14. I watched his name on my screen and let it go. He called again at 9:31. Again at 9:47. At 9:52, I picked up. I told him I was at work. I told him I would see him when I got home. My voice was the same voice I had used with him across 12 years of mornings. Steady, warm, giving him nothing. He said okay. I hung up and returned to the essay. He called his attorney before he called me back. I learned that later. It told me everything about what was happening in that building across town. That his first instinct when his world began to collapse was not to reach for his wife, but to reach for his defense. Some things confirm themselves without requiring commentary. At noon, Bernadette brought lunch. We ate and talked about a departmental scheduling matter that neither of us was genuinely thinking about. At one point, she reached across the desk and placed her hand over mine and said nothing at all. I nodded. That was the whole of it, and it was enough. I graded essays all afternoon. Graduate students writing about language, its architecture, its failures, its precision when used correctly. Across the city, in a federal building, the language Conrad had spoken at a restaurant table was being read into an official record by investigators with subpoena authority. I found something quietly perfect in that symmetry. Completely, specifically perfect. At 3:47, my phone lit up. Sylvia Drummond. 2 words. It's done. I set my pen down. I looked out Bernadette's window at the Memphis afternoon. The light coming through at the angle it comes through in late afternoon in this city. Amber and unhurried. And I exhaled. For the first time in weeks, I simply exhaled. The collapse was not dramatic. It was administrative. And that made it permanent. I have studied language long enough to understand that the most consequential things are rarely announced. They arrive in the register of the ordinary, a brief email, a suspended agreement, a name quietly removed from a letterhead. The noise of a dramatic ending gives people something to respond to, something to position themselves around. The silence of an administrative one gives them nothing except the fact of it. Conrad's world ended in the language of formal correspondence, and I read every word of it with the full attention of a woman who had spent her career understanding exactly what carefully chosen words are designed to conceal. The changes began long before any criminal filing became public. His removal from a civic board came first. A single email, brief, considerate in tone, the language of an institution protecting itself while appearing to offer grace. He was stepping back during a personal matter. One sentence. No elaboration. I read it for what it didn't say, which was everything. His largest business partner followed not long afterward, a suspension of their joint venture pending review, drafted in language so measured that a casual reader might have believed it was temporary. It was not temporary. The phrasing of a permanent severance dressed as a pause is a specific register, and I recognized it immediately. Two associates who had shaken Ingrid Merck's hand at the university reception stopped returning his calls. The Memphis business community did not gather to make pronouncements. It simply rearranged itself around an absence, efficiently, without ceremony. The way institutions always manage the arithmetic of association when the cost rises above the value. Then Sylvia called me one afternoon with an update. The associate from the university reception, the man whose name I had recognized in the holding company filings, had met with investigators. Voluntarily. I asked how long he and Conrad had known each other. 15 years, Sylvia said. I remember looking out my office window after she told me that. 15 years. Longer than my marriage. Long enough to build businesses together. Long enough to exchange favors. Long enough to believe a man would stand beside you when standing beside you became expensive. He hadn't. According to Sylvia, the meeting had been productive. That was the word she used. Productive. I understood exactly what it meant. It told me precisely what kind of loyalty Conrad had built his world on. The kind that functions only as long as the cost of maintaining it remains lower than the cost of abandoning it. The moment that calculation shifted, 15 years meant nothing. Months later, when criminal charges were formally filed, they became public record. Attempted murder, financial fraud, criminal conspiracy. 3 counts that carried Conrad's name into a category of language from which no amount of professional reputation can retrieve it. Local press picked it up within hours. The story that circulated was not the one Conrad had spent 12 years composing. The devoted husband, the civic contributor, the successful Memphis businessman. The story that circulated was the one assembled in a folder that was now part of an evidentiary record. I had written that story one timestamp at a time. It was the more accurate one. By then, Ingrid Merck had already distanced herself from Conrad's world. Through separate counsel, she had begun managing her own exposure and had withdrawn from the shared narrative they once maintained. She did not make a public statement. She did not cooperate in any formal sense that benefited the prosecution directly. What she did was simpler and more damaging. She stopped. She stopped defending, stopped explaining, stopped helping. She left Conrad to construct a narrative alone that had always required 2 people to hold it. Sylvia called me again that afternoon. The divorce filing had been accepted by the court. Conrad had been served. I asked one question. I asked how long before it was final. She told me. I thanked her and ended the call. Then I called Noel Carver. I told him I was ready to talk about what comes next. The last time I sat across from Conrad Foss was not at a restaurant. It was not in our living room. It was in a lawyer's office on a Thursday morning with fluorescent lighting overhead and a court reporter sitting in the corner with her hands resting on her machine, waiting. More than a year had passed since the dinner. There was nothing romantic about it, nothing unresolved. The room had the temperature of a room where things are finished, not started, and everyone in it understood that. Conrad's attorney had arrived knowing exactly what the terrain looked like. By then, the criminal proceedings were well underway. The financial documentation had been examined from every angle. The trust filings had been reviewed, challenged, and dismantled. The evidentiary record had only grown stronger with time. When you represent a man facing allegations of attempted murder, financial fraud, and criminal conspiracy, when the documentary record against your client continues to expand rather than contract, there is very little terrain left to negotiate. There is only the question of how much your client loses through settlement versus how much he risks losing if every remaining issue proceeds to judgment. Conrad's attorney had advised him to settle. Conrad had settled. That was the entirety of what this meeting was. The formal execution of a conclusion everyone in the room had already reached. I received the Aldine Trust in full. Every co-signatory document Conrad had threaded through 9 years of careful positioning had been formally revoked by Noel Carver long before we ever reached this table. The trust was sealed, intact, untouched, exactly what my family had left me, not diminished by a single filing. I received a significant portion of Conrad's business assets, those that could be valued and divided under the settlement agreement. Legal fees recovered in full. The house, which I had no interest in keeping, would be sold with proceeds distributed on terms that reflected the circumstances of the marriage's dissolution. And my name, Foss, I kept. Not as a remnant of Conrad. As a professional identity I had built across 20 years of academic work that belonged entirely to me regardless of how it was acquired. Conrad did not look at me, not once during the entire proceeding. He looked at the documents his attorney placed in front of him. He looked at the wall behind my head. He looked at the court reporter, at the ceiling, at the edge of the table. Anywhere that was not my face. He signed everything he was given without comment. When the last page was signed, he stood, and his hands moved to button his jacket. A gesture so practiced and automatic that it read as the final reflex of a man whose performed self had operated on muscle memory long after everything else had failed. He walked out without speaking. The door closed behind him. The sound it made was very small, very final. I noted, with the same precision I had applied to everything over the preceding months, that he had not looked at me once, not even at the end. I filed that away the way I had filed everything else, not as pain, simply as information. A fact about the man? A final entry. Noel Carver walked me through the trust documentation after Conrad left. Every corrected filing, every revoked provision, the full confirmation that what my family had built and preserved and passed to me was whole. He spoke carefully and completely, and when he finished, I thanked him, and he left. I sat alone in that room for a few minutes, a folder of signed documents on the table in front of me. No performance required, no strategy running, no language being managed or monitored or measured for what it concealed beneath its surface. Just me, in a room, finished. I did not feel triumphant. I felt something quieter than that. Something that does not have a clean name, but sits in the body like the return of something you did not realize had been absent. I felt like myself. I picked up the folder. I put on my coat. I walked out of the building into a Memphis afternoon that asked absolutely nothing of me. My phone rang before I reached my car. A student, one of my graduate students, with a question about an assignment. I answered it. We talked about language all the way home. I came back to my classroom on a Tuesday morning 3 weeks after the settlement. Same room, same chair behind the seminar table, same stack of texts I have been teaching from for 15 years. The graduate students filed in the way they always do. Laptops open before they sit down, coffee cups leaving rings on the seminar table, the low murmur of people finishing a conversation they started in the hallway. None of them knew what had happened. They knew I had taken a leave of absence. They knew I had returned. 1 or 2 of them looked at me with the careful attention of young people trying to determine if a professor they respect is all right without asking directly. I gave them nothing to worry about and everything to learn. I taught the seminar the way I have always taught it, without performance, without announcement, with the precision that comes from spending your entire professional life inside the thing you are explaining. The topic was one I return to every year because it never exhausts itself. The power of language as instrument, as evidence, as the mechanism by which intention becomes visible, whether the speaker intends it or not. I have taught this material across 15 years of seminars, and I have always believed it. I believed it differently that morning, with the weight of a woman for whom it had recently been not academic, but operational. I told them that language is never neutral, that every word chosen in what a speaker believes is confidence is still a word, still a record of the mind that produced it, still traceable, still admissible in every sense of that term. I told them that silence is its own form of fluency, that the decision not to speak is a linguistic act as legible as any sentence, and that a skilled reader of language understands both. I told them that a woman who speaks every language in the room is never the least powerful person at the table. I said it without context, without explanation, without anything that would have told them why I was saying it, with the particular gravity I was giving it that morning. I didn't need to explain it. The words carried what they carried. They always do. Bernadette was sitting in the back of the room. She visits my seminars occasionally. We have done that for each other for years, sitting in on the others' teaching the way colleagues do when they want to remember why they chose this work. She had heard me teach this material before. I could see in the stillness of her that she had never heard me teach it like this. She sat without expression through the full length of the seminar, and when I reached the final point of the lecture, she caught my eye from across the room and gave me the smallest nod. Not approval. Recognition. I received it and moved on. Conrad's criminal proceedings were ongoing. The civil suit naming both Conrad and Ingrid Merck was an active discovery. Ingrid managing her exposure from Germany through American counsel, the distance doing nothing to reduce her liability. The holding company structure he had spent years assembling was frozen pending federal review. The civic board that had sent him a careful one-sentence email had filled his seat. Memphis had rearranged itself around his absence the way cities always do, without drama, without ceremony, with the clean efficiency of institutions that have no loyalty to individuals, only to their own continuity. I dismissed the class, watched my students gather their things and move toward the door with their notebooks and their questions and their futures entirely ahead of them. Bernadette stayed in her seat until the last student left. Then she stood. She didn't say anything. I didn't either. We walked out of the seminar room together, into the hallway, and then out of the building into the afternoon. Language is never just communication. In the right hands, it is the sharpest instrument a person can carry.